So we can do it a little bit differently from a normal webinar. Since there are not very many people here today, would quite a few of the people who are here are from KMUTT. So other people, maybe you could introduce yourselves so we can direct it towards what you would need. So Anita, are you here? Hello, Anita?
Yes, I am here. Yes.
Where do you work? What sort of work do you do?
I'm Anita Sundaresan, and I'm from India, and currently I'm working in Asia Pacific International University in Saraburi, Moklek. Yes, okay. I teach in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities.
Thank you. I hope this proves useful. Someone is calling themselves iPhone, which I guess you need to change your name in the... Is iPhone here? Is someone called iPhone? No? Natanan, are you here, Natanan?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, thank you, yes.
I'm so sorry.
Where do you work? And
I work at the Faculty of Education, Thaksin University, which is in the south of Thailand, in Songkhla province, in Thailand. Yep. Nice to meet you here, and nice to meet you all today here in Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Pasara?
Yeah.
Is it Pasara?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, thank you.
My name is Pasara Namsang. I'm from Chayapum Ratchapat University. Yes.
Okay.
Nice to meet you all.
And you? Rujira? Is that going to be is that the name, right name, Rujira?
Okay, that is my name.
No? Yeah. No, they've disappeared. Rujira, are you here? No. Terry? Is there someone called Terry here?
Yes, Ajahn. Hello, good morning, everyone, and good morning, Ajahn. My name is Terry, and I'm a master degree student from KMUTT.
Okay. Leisandra? You've got a lot of names there. Leisandra, May. Are you here? No. And Ray? No? Okay. So what we were planning, we can change it a little bit. Please feel free to ask questions, to interrupt, to do whatever you want to, if there's any points where you're not very clear. So what we're planning is we're going to talk about the overview, the theories, the principles underlying languaging. Probably take about an hour for that. And then Ajahn Ong will be a lot more practical, and he'll talk about one of the courses we've created, the hobby course, so you can see how the principles are put into practice. And because this is a webinar for TAL, we'll finish by looking at how we might do research into languaging. So what we're going to be starting off with is a few key questions which should underpin our work. So I'd like people to think about why we teach English, what English to teach, because the world is changing. The traditional model of native speaker English as the goal is changing, and how to teach English. So we'll start with why we should teach English. Why should we teach English? Would you like to type in, I'll give you a minute, you can type in a reason for what do you think is the key main reason why we teach English? And you could type in an answer into the chat. Feel free to type into the chat an answer for what do you think is the key main reason why we teach English? Anyone else typing anything in? Okay, so it's in the probably we're getting two main patterns coming out of your responses, it seems. A couple of you have used the term lingua franca or international language. Some of you are talking about communicate, and Natanan it's a tool that's pretty much important in life, I guess, is what you're saying there, Natanan. And yes, these are things we will look at today. We will look at the English as a lingua franca movement. We will look at the issues of communication. But how we're viewing it here for languaging purposes is that basically we want our learners to use English effectively for real world purposes. We don't really care whether students can use subject-verb agreement correctly or not. If that doesn't have any impact on how effective their real-world use of English is, we're not very concerned with that. So if using English effectively for real-world purposes probably links to your responses about communication. And especially, I think it was, who was it? For Natanan, you talk about living, working, and studying. And that's how we're viewing things as well.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Your question again? I may apologize for not being turned on the camera.
It wasn't a question. I was just reading what you said in the chat. In the chat, you talked about living, working, and studying. And yes, these are sorts of things we're thinking about as well. Yeah. So yes, if I'm guessing most people seem to be working at universities. If you're working at universities, you want to help your students use English more effectively at universities. So studying the English for academic purposes is often quite an important purpose in English. But we also need to be looking towards the future and work. And this would be English for occupational purposes. Sorry about my dogs barking in the background. There's people walking down the street. These are what most people consider as being English for specific purposes. If we're looking at communication, communication always has a purpose. So we need to be thinking about the purposes, English for specific purposes. Nearly all of English for specific purposes work is about studying and working. But as Natanam pointed out in her response in the chat, there's also life. And we're going to call that playing, English for playing. And hopefully you'll see that we actually think that English for playing may be as important as English for studying and English for working. So we've got these key main purposes. So we're looking at using English in the real world. And when students use English in the real world, they don't necessarily do the sorts of things that we typically do in classrooms. When students are using English in the real world for real world purposes, they use their phones, they use Google Translate, they use whatever tools they have available for them. And one of you in the chat mentioned tools. And this is the reality of English now. Students generally have mobile phones seemingly permanently attached to their hands. They use them all the time, and they help them with using English. They may be using something like Google Translate. They may be accessing online dictionaries. Students in the real world these days, these tools and affordances are very important for real world language use. We need to, I mean, it's not going to go away. Google Translate just keeps getting better and better. You may feel that we shouldn't be encouraging students to use Google Translate, but it's the reality of real world communication these days. So there are a lot of online tools that are available for students to help them when using English for real world purposes. So we see that we should be also helping the students to use these tools because they will use them in the real world. Another issue is that there are lots of models of English available now. You can find models of pretty much every genre there is available on the web. I mean, let's suppose in your workplace, you were asked to write a business plan. Have any of you ever had experience with writing business plans before? Has anyone ever had to write a business plan before? It's not a normal thing to do. And I'm guessing that no one here has ever taught students how to write a business plan. What we're looking at is there are always new genres which students will have to use. If they're using English effectively for real world purposes, they will always come across real world purposes that they're not really prepared for. They need to be able to find models and analyze models and work out how to use language in the real world based on looking at what's available. It's not that everything we teach them in the classroom and that's it. Now they can go out and use English in the real world. In the real world, we can't predict what they're going to be using English for. And because of that, we can't prepare them for every context. So we have to be able to prepare them for being able to use English in contexts they've never experienced before as well. And if we look at some sort of recent research into what new English language graduates moving into the workplace, the main problems they had in the workplace were two main problems they had. One was that wherever they were working had their own terminology, their own jargon, which they had to learn. There's no way we can teach students the phrasing and jargon used by every company. They'll have to learn it on the job. But we can teach them how to be able to understand and more easily access that phrasing and remember it. And it doesn't matter if we've been teaching students English for specific purposes for 4 years of a bachelor's degree. When they go into work, there will be new genres they encounter. We can't cover every genre in our English teaching. So again, we need to be helping students to deal with these new genres, not just teaching them a few genres and that's it. It's more important is being able to deal with unfamiliar genres. So based on these ideas that we're looking at, you use tools, you use models, you solve problems, then what theoretical framework could we use which would help us frame things so that we can be more productive in our curriculum design of our English? And this is the first principle. We'll cover 3 principles. There are 3 main principles underlying languaging curriculum. The first principle is languaging. And languaging, like quite a few of the important terms in ELT and applied linguistics, unfortunately, languaging has 2 completely different meanings. The meaning we're using here is the meaning from linguistic philosophy. There's a whole area of philosophy which is devoted to the philosophy of language. and languaging is a term used in philosophy. And it's been around for quite a while, but no one's paid that much attention to it in applied linguistics. If we look at, so Lardo in 1979 talks about languaging, and he says, in languaging, you don't pay attention to the language itself. You pay it, all your attention is focused on the goals. So this links to those people who put in the issue of communicating in the chat. Everything is about achieving goals. It doesn't really matter how you achieve those goals as long as you achieve them. The language side of it is very much secondary. Just to clear things up, there is a second meaning of languaging, which comes from the work of Merrill Swain. And Merrill Swain actually quoted Lardo in his first article when he set up his model of languaging. But when he quoted Lardo and then he said, this is not at all what I mean by languaging. And he created a completely new meaning, which is all about students talking about language in group work, basically. And this whole thing really frustrates me, that you have a word which someone else just chooses and gives a completely different meaning. And so from now on, no one knows which of the meanings of languaging you're referring to. You have to be explicit. We're focusing on the original meaning of languaging from philosophy. So under this original meaning of languaging, language is a process, it's not a product. We're not interested in language as a product. We're not interested in all these rules to be followed because rules are product oriented. We're interested in process. So we're far more interested in things like strategies, for example. And within philosophy, this sort of work has also, the idea of languaging has also been related to language learning. And so Thibault, who's also a philosopher, looking at the idea of languaging as it relates to language learning, just says that the whole point of languaging is participating, getting things done. It's all about achieving goals. It's not about the language itself. The whole focus of languaging is to get things done. What those things are depends on the students. Every student has their individual objectives depending on the individual context they're working in. But the whole goal is on getting things done. So the whole of language teaching is looking at, can we help students to be successful in getting things done? The main criterion for evaluation is success. It's not accuracy or anything like that. It's success. So even if they use bad English to get things done, if they're successful in getting things done, they've achieved their goals. Why are we worried about it? So this is the first principle which underlies the languaging curriculum, the idea of languaging from philosophy. The second question I asked you at the beginning is what English to teach? A few years ago, this would have been a strange question to ask, or maybe the answer would have been, are we teaching British English or American English? Those were the only two choices. Say 20 years ago, that was what most people thought about English. There's only a choice between whether you want to use British English or American English. Within the last 20 years, things have changed substantially. So from your experience, what do you think is the English we should teach? Should we still be relying on something like American English or British English? Or should we be open to things like world Englishes? Or should we be just looking at high-level Thai speakers English? Again, in the chat, can you share your ideas about what do you think the model of English is that we should be aiming for in teaching English? Again, please enter your response in the chat. What model of English do you think we should be aiming for when we're teaching English? World Englishes, yeah. Anyone else got any models they aim for? Communicative, World Englishes, you think again? Okay, international communication. Oh, any English. Oh, we're getting very broad in the models now. The world has changed. We're not just focusing on British or American English. So if we look briefly at the history of English language teaching and what models have been used in the history of English language teaching. If we go back many, many years, before 1950, the main purpose in teaching English was to help students access native speaker culture. They should be able to read Shakespeare, they should be able to read Charles Dickens, things like that. So this was the era of grammar translation as the main teaching methodology. The main purpose of teaching English was to help non-English American people integrate into high formality native speaker culture. We've gone way beyond that these days. Very few students learn English for integrative purposes. Most students learn English for instrumental purposes. They want to do things with English, not just access English culture. And so from the 1950s to around 2000, the main purpose was seen as using language to communicate with native speakers. And because of this, the standard native speaker norms were the models of English that were being aimed for. And 1950s, 1960s into the 1970s, this was all audiolingualism. 1980s, 1990s, we were looking at communicative language teaching. But both of these still looked at native speakers as the model that students should be aiming towards. In the 1980s and 1990s, we got the work on World Englishes, which a couple of you mentioned in the chat just now. Basically, anything in ELT is normally about 10 to 20 years behind the theory. So it was only, even though the work in World Englishes started in the 1980s, it was only in the 2000s that this had much impact on ELT itself. And so the awareness that it wasn't only British English and American English, there was Indian English, Hong Kong English, Singaporean English, etc. There are lots of native speakers, although it's very unclear whether we should be using the term native speakers with groups like this, because the term native speakers is very problematic. But so it's using language with other high-level English. Within ELT, this still meant that standard native speaker norms dominated, but there was an awareness that there should also be an acknowledgement of the other varieties of English that existed in the world. Then in the 2000s, we got the English as a lingua franca movement, which some of you mentioned earlier for the first question I asked you. So with the English as a lingua franca, it's not about talking to high-level speakers, it's talking to anyone with whom the only medium of communication you share is English, because English is the most international language that exists at the moment in the world. Even people with traditionally viewed as low proficiency competence in English, two of them may have to use English to talk to each other. This is English as lingua franca. English as lingua franca can also be you talking to me as a native speaker and you're a Thai, it would still come under English as lingua franca. It's basically any communication in English, and it's not looking so much at what the linguistic background of the speakers are or what their proficiency is. It's just any use of English to communicate. And this is where there was a start to be a heavy questioning of the native speaker norms. Are native speaker norms really suitable as a basis for ELT? And it's probably found that no, they're probably not that suitable. Instead, there's a lot of issues of context-specific norms, but ELF as a research area has a lot of problems about what are the norms of English, and it doesn't really seem to have provided an answer yet. What I'm suggesting today is that in 2020, we started the languaging curriculum, probably 2020, 2021, we started playing with this and using it. And basically, we're not even looking at using language with others. The main purpose is using language to do things. That speakers always have goals, so it's, do they achieve their goals? And to do this, in some cases, there are actually no norms at all, which is a fairly radical departure from most of ELT. In some contexts, there are context-specific norms. In a few contexts, these context-specific norms are native speaker norms, but there are some things you want to do with language where you don't need to have any norms. There are some things where you have fairly broad norms, and there are some cases where you have standard native speaker norms. Everything is context specific. If you were applying for a job as an English language teacher and you wrote your application essay, you would be expected to fit your application essay to standard native speaker norms. So in that context, standard native speaker norms are the norms that help you to use language to do things. In other contexts, as we will see later today, there are no norms for using language. So within the research literature, looking at this, it's going to be English as a lingua franca, which is going to be the most useful source to draw on to help us think about what to do in languaging. And English as a lingua franca, it's gone through various phases. Jenkins identifies 3 main phases in English as a lingua franca. Originally, because of its roots in World Englishes, ELF researchers tried to describe ELF, but they found they couldn't do it because there's too much variation. There are no clear norms per se. So then they shifted to looking at language use strategies. And this is the part of ELF that we will draw on in languaging. Currently, the third movement in ELF is more related to translanguaging and mixing languages together and so on. But if we are English language teachers, students, parents, administrators, etc., expect us to teach English, not to mix languages. So that's problematic. That most recent movement in ELF is problematic for ELT because of public perceptions. The other key aspect of English as a lingua franca is that the world is changing. We can't predict what language and what things will be needed in 10 years' time, because the world is changing too quickly these days. So we can't set clear product objectives for language teaching because the world will have changed by the time the students get to use them. So we're going to be looking at language use strategies. The other area I'd like to look at with English as a lingua franca is how it's informed English language teaching. And it hasn't actually had that much impact on English language teaching yet. If you look at any standard ELT course book, there's almost no influence of ELF in a standard English language course book. The impact of ELF on language teaching is still not particularly noticeable. There have been lots of attempts, and Hino and Oda tried to categorize the model, how ELF has influenced ELT. And they came up with 5 kind of ways in which people have tried to integrate English as a lingua franca into English language teaching. So some teachers just teach about ELF, or they set up ELF role plays, or they provide exposure to ELF. So if you're playing a listening passage in the classroom, it's not just a British or American speaker anymore. They also argue content-based teaching can be ELF, and they talk about participation in communities as being an approach in the ELF. For us, the only one we really see as being important here is this participation in communities. And we see this as being linked to authentic communication in real-world contexts. So within real-world contexts, what we need to be getting our students to do is to communicate in real-world contexts for authentic goals. Then we need to get them to participate in the communities that are available to them. Doing that is going to be far more important than teaching them about ELF, which sounds more like something that a researcher is more interested in than a teacher to me. So when we're teaching ELT, everything should be directed at authentic communication in real-world contexts where students can participate in the communities, because every real-world context has different norms, and students need to learn these norms. We can't teach them every context, so we have to teach them how to learn the norms of a context is what we would need to teach. And so these context-specific norms, we need to make students aware that there are norms, or maybe there are contexts where there are no norms, and how to identify the norms, how to phrase their language. We need to be teaching them the strategies for dealing with context-specific norms. And even educated native speakers need to learn English when they're faced with a new context. In many ways, I'm actually the model of the traditional native speaker. I am British, I am highly educated, etc. I'm a model of what the traditional view of the native speaker was, but I still have to learn English. As an example, I was making a project application with a couple of colleagues, and part of the project application was to write a marketing statement. So I wrote a marketing statement and I was happy with it. And I sent it to my colleagues, and one of my colleagues reacted, yes, the ideas are good, but you're not writing in appropriate English. This is academic English, not marketing English. I needed to learn marketing English. The context of writing a marketing statement meant that there were other norms that I needed to learn to write. So I found some models. I looked at successful projects and their applications for the same, within the same process I was writing for. I analyzed their marketing statements and I rewrote my statement, and my colleagues said, maybe I'm going to have a future as a marketing expert because I could learn from the norms. This is, a lot of people think educated native speakers don't need to learn English anymore. You're constantly learning because contexts change. This is perhaps if you're using a new web application, a new online application, you have to learn how that works. If you use Twitter, you need to learn how to tweet. There are always new context-specific norms you need to learn. So the second principle underlying languaging is English as a lingua franca. And within this, there are some cases where there are no clear norms of language use. So if there are no clear norms of language use, it's impossible to set linguistic objectives. Even in those cases where there are norms, they are context-specific norms. And everything is about conveying the meanings, not the forms they're conveyed in. What we need to be teaching students is to support using language use strategies. These are not language learning strategies. This is language use strategies. It's strategies for using language. In some cases, these are similar to the communication strategies which were dominant in the 1980s. But communication strategies, and also a lot of ELF, is all about conversational speaking. But a lot of things that students want to do with language are not necessarily conversational speaking. We need to help them to analyze and learn from existing models, like I did with a marketing statement. I tried to write a marketing statement, I failed. I found some models, I analyzed them, I learned from them, I did it again. What are the strategies I used in analyzing the models, learning from them, and reproducing the models in my own writing? That's the sort of strategies we need to look at. And also, going back to what we saw with languaging, using any of the resources or tools available to support the language use. Google Translate is great. So, we've had languaging, we've had English as a lingua franca. The third question I asked was, how should we teach English? And so what I'd like you to think about and what I'd like you to post in the chat this time is, what would you say is a principle that guides how you teach English? What principles guide how you teach? Not what you teach, but principles that guide how you teach. Please post a couple of principles in the chat. So when you make decisions in the classroom, what influences the decisions you make in the classroom? Thank you. Any others? Okay, some of your answers seem to be more related to the what English to teach, perhaps. What we did is we came up with 6 main principles we wanted to have manifested in the curriculum. So we want to highlight the importance of learning English, of English as a global language. So some students come into class thinking, oh, it's English, I just have to learn how to make subjects and verbs agree, and then I can just forget about it and go back to using Thai. There are a few students who think like that. We need to show them the importance of English. This is really easy. Just get students to search for the same topic on English Wikipedia and Thai Wikipedia. And you generally find that English Wikipedia has 10 or 20 times the amount of information as Thai Wikipedia. If they want to learn about anything through Wikipedia, they would do better using English Wikipedia for most topics. We want to raise their confidence. There's a lot of research, even if we're looking at conversation and interpersonal communication, there's quite a lot of research which shows that students' confidence actually affects listeners' comprehension. If students appear confident, listeners understand them more easily. But we just want students to be confident in their English use. We want them to be motivated. We want to promote mastery orientations. There's one theory in psychology about the difference between performance orientations and mastery orientations. Performance orientations are things like getting a good grade. A mastery orientation is doing the best you can, producing what you really want to produce, irrespective of whether it'll affect your grade badly or not. So we want to promote mastery orientations. We want to create a sense of achievement that students feel they are actually progressing and achieving things. And perhaps most importantly, we want to encourage long-term English use. With most courses, you have maybe 45 hours with the students in the classroom and then they're gone. 45 hours is not a lot of exposure to help students learn. We want them to be using English outside the classroom as much as possible. And this doesn't just mean that the teacher tells them they have to use English. We want them to use English outside the classroom because they want to. And I mean, there's been a lot of research into this, and research shows that, say, for example, for vocabulary knowledge, the extent to which students are exposed to English language media outside the classroom has a much greater impact on vocabulary knowledge than anything the teacher does in the classroom. So we want to get students to expose themselves outside the class. So, having set those goals, how do we change them into principles that are related to teaching? For awareness of the importance of English, expose them to a lot of real-world English use, show them why it's useful to them. For confidence, be non-judgmental. Don't judge their English use. And as we will see later, teachers are actually not in a position to be able to judge students' English use, and we're going to argue. For motivation, give students choice so that they're doing the things they want to do. They're personally invested in what they're doing in the language classroom. If you're personally invested in it, you're motivated to do it. Produce mastery orientations, use authentic outcomes. Everything is about authentic communication. It's not about pleasing the teacher. For a sense of achievement, provide scaffolds. If they are having problems doing the things they want to do, provide scaffolds to help them achieve what they want to achieve. And make the English use outside the classroom enjoyable. How do we do all this? The closest way in which we can do this, the closest theory is probably experiential learning. Of all the learning theories, we looked at experiential learning. And so we're looking at getting authentic real-world communication for personal goals. Again, 20, 30 years ago, this would have been almost impossible to do. Now with Web 2 and all social media and all these things, it's actually really easy to get students to engage in authentic real-world communication for personal goals. We want to use macro and micro scaffolds to support success. And I've just given a few examples of macro and micro scaffolds at the bottom there for the third of the courses we use. A macro scaffold is a planned scaffold that's about how the whole course or how several lessons are planned to provide a progress through the lessons. Micro scaffolds are contingent. They're provided by the teacher. They're very specific points provided by a teacher based on a specific problem that a specific student has. And we also look at encouraging and promoting reflection. One of the main evaluation tools of the curriculum is reflective journals. And we're not marking them for accuracy or anything like that. We're marking them for reflection. So based on all this, and we can now get to define the languaging curriculum. And so we define the languaging curriculum. The aim is for students to engage in learning to strategically make use. It's all about teaching strategies and use strategies. The available tools, use whatever apps, whatever programs, because in the real world, students use these. Help students to use these effectively and critically. Using resources, we saw with the use of analyzing and learning from models to produce language in specific contexts. And the key thing is, it's all about being successful in doing things in English for real world purposes. It's not about producing good English. It's about being successful in doing things. So based on this, when we're teaching languaging, there's some do's and don'ts. Everything is focused on doing things. There's almost no focus on the English language itself. There is no traditional teaching of vocabulary, grammar, any of that. Everything is about doing things with English. It's all about success. There's nothing about accuracy. If you are successful but inaccurate, that doesn't matter. If you are accurate but unsuccessful, then you need to change. It's all focused on language as a process, not language as a product. It's all, the things we teach are language use strategies. We don't teach language forms. It's all real world use. There is no classroom practice. In the first time we taught this course, as the pilot course, Ajahn Ong did do a classroom practice and it failed badly. Everything else was real world use, and it was for the classroom practice activity, all the students copied and plagiarized. For everything else they did, there was no plagiarism, no copying, nothing, because they wanted to do things for real world purposes, because they have freedom of choice in what they're doing. There are no dictated activities that they have to do this. We set broad areas to work within. Make a video and post it on YouTube. The video can be about whatever you want. Well, you'll see how it works in a minute, but there's freedom of choice. And everything is about promoting feelings of comfort. We try to remove anxiety. We want students to be comfortable and confident. Okay, I'm taking a bit longer than I should about this, so I will skip the next slide, which might surprise you, and go to what concerns we might have within this. If we're using this language in curriculum approach, there are some concerns. One is how to assess students, and this is, we still don't know the answer to this. We still don't know how we should evaluate our students, because we're looking at success is the criterion, not accuracy. There are no models to judge against. But students are engaging in things they want to do for their purposes and with other people, not with the teacher. So if the other person helps them and they're successful, it doesn't matter. This is a problem for teachers. How do we measure success? Because it's the student who judges success. I think there's going to have to be a complete mind shift in assessment, but we're still struggling with this. If any of you are experts in assessment and would like to help us out with this, please contact us, because we're still struggling with this issue. Every student is doing something different. Even from after the first lesson, every student is doing what they want to do. We've got this freedom of choice. So this means that you can't do a lot of the traditional things that teachers do in the classroom, where you put the same thing on the board and you work through it and all the students are working through it together. Teachers need to be flexible to address all these different things that all the different students are doing. And this needs a bit of a change in mind shift from traditional teaching to a new way of teaching. Again, because every student is doing something different, this affects evaluation as well, because some students will set themselves difficult things to do, some students will set themselves easy things to do, but they're both being measured for success. There can be unreliability in evaluation. Yes, we're providing choice of topics. Students have freedom to choose, but from our experience, we do need to set some constraints. For example, for the third of the language in curriculum courses is writing a Wikipedia page. We strongly recommend that students do not write a Wikipedia page about a living person, because the Wikipedia rules about writing about living people are far more rigorous than about other things. So if students write about a Wikipedia page about a living person, they have a greater chance of failure. So there are some constraints like that that we've had to introduce based on our experience with running the course. The amazing thing, what we're doing, everything is about communicating the real world. Aren't students going to copy? Well, one is Vygotsky. One of the lesser known aspects of Vygotsky's sociocultural theory is he argues there are 3 types of copying. One is imitation, emulation, and mimicry. We encourage imitation. In effect, when I was using existing models of marketing statements to write my own marketing statement, I was imitating those marketing statements. Most genre-based teaching is imitation. You are imitating a structure. You are imitating and even copying certain useful phrases, but you're putting in all your own information within that. There's no blind copying. And we've actually found that blind copying is not a concern at all in the languaging curriculum. The last possible concern, which many teachers find challenging, is that we don't care about accuracy very much. Within there are 3 courses within the languaging curriculum. The first course, we don't care about accuracy at all. By the time of the 3rd course, where they're writing Wikipedia pages, there needs to be a certain level of accuracy. So there is a buildup of accuracy, but accuracy is only important in some contexts. In other contexts, it is not important. What we're doing is we're trying to encourage comfort and confidence in using English to begin with, and accuracy may be addressed later if needed. So these are some concerns, and this means that some teachers won't feel comfortable teaching the languaging curriculum. It does need a shift in mindset. There are still problems we haven't solved yet. However, when we look at what the students say about our teaching, it makes us feel really, really good. We feel really happy. One thing we mentioned was that we want to get students to use long-term use of English. The first course, which Ajahn Ong will talk about in a few minutes, is the hobby course. Students engage about their hobby on Reddit. When we've checked, we've done informal surveys of what students do 6 months after the end of the course, and most of the students are still using Reddit regularly 6 months after the course. The amount of exposure they've had to English through that 6 months is way more than we can do in the classroom. So just in terms of encouraging long-term exposure to English, this is very successful. Then if we look at some quotations from students, they see that they're actually aware that they're learning from doing. The students are aware they're learning from doing. They're not just studying English as an academic subject where all they get is lectures. Here they're learning from doing. And they see this as being ideal for their English class. We say you don't need accuracy. I don't know how many of you spotted that the student wrote leaning, not learning, but who cares, because they've conveyed their message successfully. It doesn't matter that they wrote leaning, not learning. It doesn't matter. They see this, a lot of the students come in frustrated with all their previous English courses where they never really felt that they successfully learned anything, but now they feel that they're actually progressing in their English. And some of them even say that it's one of the greatest subjects they've learned ever. So that is the summary of the principles of languaging.